Every story needs at least one good villain. It's a pretty boring story without an antagonist of some sort hovering around the fringes and threatening to cause mayhem. All of my stories have at least one villain, especially the Teapot Cottage stories, which without a villain would probably be a little bit flat and boring. Most people have a villain in their lives, even if that's not a human villain. Sometimes a villain can be the thief of time, it can be the level of stress that someone's under. Villains take many forms, but for the most part, when you have a story involving characters, you need to have a person in there who causes problems. It makes the story so much richer, so much more interesting to the reader to find out how our protagonist deals with the villain. So what goes into deciding what a villain is going to look and feel like to a character comes down to many things. My villains are generally a combination of a number of different people that I've pulled together in my head. And these come from experiences that I've had with people. They've come from experiences some of my previous clients have had with people. And some of it comes from my imagination, as if to say, well, what is this particular character's vulnerability? What is it that would upset them the most in life? Are they focused on family? Are they interested in having good friendships that they can trust? And what happens when something that means a lot to them, or a person who means a lot to them, comes along and disrupts everything? What impact does that have on that person with that vulnerability? And so the villains take many forms. For example, in the upcoming book, The Stuff You Fail to Notice, which is book 5 in the Teapot Cottage Tales, one of our main antagonists, who is in fact herself the villain to the main protagonist, we also find a little bit about her background and find that she's had a villain in her past who has changed the way she thought and the way she decided to go on in the world and live her life. So past villains have an impact on current villains in some cases. So this woman who has caused no end of disruption to her best friend has reasons in the past for doing so that relate to a person who disrupted her life when she was at a very vulnerable time. And so that shaped who she went on to become and how she went on to behave in her life with the people around her. People who decimate us leave us with a lack of trust, and that can have very big impacts on us going forward in building and sustaining relationships with other people. But villains are in and of themselves driven by something. And I think the important thing, well, for me anyway, in creating and introducing a villain into a story is to make the reader aware that that person is a villain for a reason. And that goes directly back to all my training and all my work as a psychologist, where I was more concerned with the reasons behind someone's behavior than I ever was with the behavior itself. And so when we look to a villain, we look at the reasons why they're a villain, what's gone on in their life, and the person who created problems for the updated villain in The Stuff You Fail to Notice obviously had issues of their own that made them that first villain of the piece. And so it goes. And if we draw it all back, if we trace it all back through the time, through the development of the human character, we come to understand why certain people behave the way they do. And certainly when they behave badly or poorly or hurtfully, it's interesting to know the reasons behind that, because it helps the reader to appreciate that fact that we all know and we all live with in everyday life, that people are inherently good. They're not all bad. If someone is behaving badly, there are reasons for that. And while in most cases it doesn't excuse their behavior, especially, if they're adults, and we know that most adults are fully capable of understanding and acting within the parameters of right and wrong, it doesn't make it okay, but it makes it understandable. And those are the things that make a character relatable to the reader. So villains are fun, they're necessary because that's what makes the story, that's what gives the story the layers that it has for the main protagonist in any of the stories to overcome the demons that drive them and the villains that create problems for them. We all need to believe in a happy ending, at least some of the time. And in the Teapot Cottage novels, there is always a happy ending of a sort. It's never usually the one that we imagine at the beginning, and it's never usually the one that the main characters in the book envisage for themselves. They usually end up in a much more different place than they once ever imagined they could. Their lives have taken a turn in a direction that they once couldn't have foreseen. And in most cases, in fact, in all cases, they end up better people. But they get there because they go through the process of rebuilding their lives from trauma, and that includes getting over what the villains have done to them. They get to a place where they can reconcile a lot of what's happened with an understanding of why it happened, and an understanding of who caused what mayhem in their lives, and they go on to transcend that and build those good lives. But the villains are important. The villains themselves do give layers to a story and enable a few quirks and bangs along the way, a little bit of disruption here and there, which keeps things interesting. So in the creation of a villain, there's a combination of past behavior that's brought them to where they are now, and they've got to be relatable as nasty people. And we've all met those, haven't we? We've all got stories of people who have hurt us, who have turned into villains in our lives. Maybe people who started off as friends, and almost everybody I know, and myself as well, and everybody I've ever worked with, has been let down badly by people they loved and trusted. And in a lot of those cases, those people had been friends, or they thought they'd been friends. And what it often happens is that you feel that you've put your ladder against the wrong wall. You've put your trust and your faith in someone, and it's turned out to be the wrong decision. And it sometimes can take a very long time for that wrong decision to show itself. Like in The Stuff You Fail to Notice, the next book coming up, the main protagonist, Minty Cartwright, finds out that her best friend of more than 40 years has been sleeping with her husband, and she never noticed any of the nuances that went on in that relationship that she had with her friend, or that her husband and herself have had collectively with that friend, or the relationship that friend had with her husband, because they'd all gone through university together, they'd all kind of matured and become responsible adults together, and she never saw any of this. And it's one of the reasons why the book is called The Stuff You Fail to Notice, because as it turns out, there is an awful lot of stuff in this woman's life that's been going on right in her face and she hasn't noticed. And I think, we're all guilty of that to some degree. But the main villain for her, as it turns out to be the woman she's once regarded as her best friend. And when you think about the depth of the betrayal in that circumstance, where your best mate has been sleeping with your husband, that kind of betrayal it's so devastating. You just can't imagine getting over that, and you can't get over that quickly. So the need to put this woman, this mistress, in context as a villain, we have to trace back and show why she was a villain. And that is basically what it comes down to. It is layering the characters, whether they're good or bad. It's layering them to make them believable, because we can all relate to something in our lives when we trace it back that's caused us to behave badly, and it's a result of something negative that happened in our past. And when we have trust issues, it's because someone in the past was a villain in our lives, and they gave us that damage to our trust, and they created problems for us in trusting other people. The warning bells go off quicker, don't they, when someone comes into your orbit and says something or does something or reminds you in some way of a person you once trusted who let you down. So I have a lot of fun with my villains, actually. I have male villains, I have female villains, I have young ones, old ones, historical ones, modern day ones, the people that are in the face at the moment. And it's just so much fun playing around with these characters and giving them the layers and the nuances that make them real to the reader. So a good villain has usually got some behavioural issues going on of their own that we can trace back. Sometimes they're just selfish people who have learned to be selfish for a certain reason, and our primary antagonist in The Stuff You Fail to Notice, we can trace her villainy back, not just to the person who blew her trust out, but also to other things that happened in her life that made her insular and more self-focused in the interests of self-protection, because she went through some stuff when she was young that most people couldn't imagine having to go through, and that turned her into it made her put a protective shell around herself, and inside that protective shell she was who she always was, but on the outside she had to project a sense of being in control and command and putting her own needs first because no one else was going to. And that's how she became the villain. And also the great thing about villains is that you can do whatever you want with them within the process. Sometimes they are redeemed, sometimes they're not. In the book that's just about to be released now, which isn't a Teapot Cottage novel, it's called Thicker Than Water. It's written in a very much darker genre. It does put a little meat on the bones of one or two of the characters in one of the Teapot Cottage novels, and it provides the big backstory to Adi Raven, who's our enduring, ongoing protagonist in the Teapot Cottage tales. But it really just comes down to looking at what happened there with those people, and looking at the villain, the major villain in that story who wasn't redeemed. And because that person wasn't redeemed, because their behavior was so bad, that created ongoing problems for the people who had to try and come to terms with it. Now, that book deals with a horrible crime and focuses more, as literary fiction does, on the impact of the crime on the people affected by it, rather than concentrating on the crime itself. So it's not a whodunit, but it does show us that certain villains can't, they're not redeemable. They are condemned to be villains forevermore. How they live with themselves is the big question we never get an answer to. But some villains, on the other hand, do recognize their own development into what they are, and they do want to make amends, and they do want to fix those elements of themselves and get rid of some of the demons that drive them. So villainy is fun, it's interesting. All villains are a combination of different personality traits of people I've known or met or heard about or had experience of, and they are chucked into the story to let the reader think, oh gosh, I don't like this person much. And then the challenge for me as a writer is to, where I can, make that villain more likable. We have people coming in who aren't very nice to start with, who end up being fairly decent people at the end of the process, and that is quite a challenge, and it's one I always enjoy. So enjoy the villains in the books, and I'll talk to you again soon.